My grandfather, a revered admiral, stood before his peers, raised his glass, and declared that my greatest achievement was wasting a uniform a real man could have worn. He said my only purpose was to be a stepping stone for my brother's brilliant career. But he didn't know I'd just found proof he was using my name, the one he spat on, to build his criminal empire. He was about to learn exactly what a wasted uniform is truly capable of. My name is Lieutenant Quinn Maddox. I'm 29 years old, and tonight I felt like an imposter in my own skin. I was standing in the grand ballroom of the Officers' Club in Norfolk, Virginia, a place that reeked of old power and expensive tradition. The air was thick with the mingled scents of gleaming mahogany and top-shelf Kentucky bourbon. All around me, immaculate dress-white uniforms moved with the fluid grace of swans. The men inside them, staff officers, future admirals, murmuring about postings at the Pentagon as if they were discussing country club memberships. My own uniform was just as white, just as crisply pressed, but under the fabric, I felt like it was still stained with the gritty, salt-laced dust of Somalia. I had just returned from a place where the heat was a physical weight, and the silence between firefights was more terrifying than the noise. A place where one of my brothers in arms, a man who had laughed with me over a cold MRE just days before, didn't come home. No one here asked me about that. They didn't see a combat-tested SEAL. They only saw the name stitched over my heart, Maddox. My brother, Liam, was the true center of this universe. He held court near the fireplace, his own uniform spotless, a smug, confident smile plastered on his face as he boasted about his fast-tracked future in the JAG Corps. He'd never seen a day of real conflict, but he wore the uniform like a birthright. I stood slightly behind him and to the left, a position I'd known my entire life. I was the shadow that proved his light was real, a decorative accessory with a lieutenant's rank. Then the sound that always commanded attention. The sharp tink-tink-tink of a spoon against a crystal glass. My grandfather, Admiral Alistair Maddox, stood near the head of the room. Retired, but his presence still sucked the air out of any space he occupied. His voice, a low rumble honed by decades of command, cut through the chatter. "Gentlemen," he began. Every eye in the room swiveled to him. "Tonight," he continued, his gaze sweeping over the crowd before landing, for a brief, chilling moment, on me. "I wish to raise a glass to the future of the Maddox legacy, to my grandson, Liam." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. His eyes, sharp and cold as a razor's edge, pinned me in place. "The Maddox family produces leaders, thinkers. We do not produce grunts who are content to follow orders and get their hands dirty in the mud." A knot of ice formed in my stomach. I could feel my mother, Eleanor, who stood beside me, give my hand a faint, nervous squeeze. It was a gesture of sympathy, but it was as frail as a leaf against a hurricane. My grandfather then turned to a cluster of high-ranking officers, a cruel, performative smile spreading across his face. He let out a short, booming laugh. "I'll tell you, gentlemen," he said, his voice loud enough for the whole room to hear. "There are some girls who like to play soldier, but in the end, their place is in the kitchen." The room erupted, not in quiet chuckles, but in a wave of loud, unrestrained laughter. It washed over me, a physical force of humiliation. I stood there, my spine ramrod straight, my face a mask of military neutrality, but inside my heart seized in my chest, squeezed by an invisible fist. My mother's grip tightened, but it was useless. The storm was already raging inside me. The moment passed. The laughter subsided into murmurs. The world spun back into its orbit, but mine had been knocked askew. Trying to maintain some semblance of grace, I moved to get a glass of water, anything to escape the lingering stares. That's when Liam, clumsy in his self-satisfaction, fumbled the leather-bound folder he was carrying. A flurry of white paper scattered across the polished floor. One sheet drifted and landed directly at the toe of my polished black shoe. The official seal of the Department of Defense was at the top. I bent down to pick it up, a reflexive act of helpfulness. And then my world stopped. It was an SF-86, the Standard Form 86, the Questionnaire for National Security Positions. A document I knew intimately. My eyes scanned the page, and then they froze, the blood turning to ice in my veins. There, in Section 20A, the line for family sponsor with active security clearance, my name was printed in bold official type. Lieutenant Quinn M. Maddox, TSSCI. But it was the line below that shattered me, the signature line. It was a forgery, a blatant, almost insulting imitation of my own hand. It was Liam's handwriting, the same clumsy looping script I had held his hand and patiently guided him to form when he was just a little boy learning his name. The memory flashed, sharp and painful, a sunlit kitchen, the smell of cookies, his small hand in mine. He hadn't just stolen my name. He had stolen a piece of our childhood, twisted it, and used it against me. The public humiliation was one thing. This was a violation. They hadn't just insulted me. They were siphoning my blood to fuel their own ambitions. His roar echoed, not in the ballroom, but in the very scars he'd carved into me since I was a child. That forged signature on the SF-86 was a key, unlocking a room inside my memory I rarely visited, a museum of slights and hurts, each one carefully preserved in the dust of my childhood. The Admiral's roar in the Officers' Club wasn't a new wound. It was merely the grand reopening of an old exhibition. My mind drifted back to a Thanksgiving when I was 15, at our family's sprawling estate in Charlottesville, Virginia. I remember the morning air, crisp and cold, with the sharp scent of November, drifting through the open windows of the old farmhouse. It was the day of the traditional Maddox hunt, a rite of passage. According to a century of tradition, this was the year the Maddox boys, my brother Liam, would be taken by my father and grandfather for their first deer hunt. I was ready. I'd been up since before dawn, dressed in my camouflage gear, my rifle cleaned and oiled. I could hit a tin can from 200 yards, a skill my maternal grandfather, a Marine sniper, had patiently taught me. I stood by the door, heart thrumming with a nervous, hopeful energy. My grandfather, Alistair, emerged from his study, smelling of coffee and authority. He looked me up and down, from my worn hunting boots to the eager expression on my face. A slow, condescending smirk spread across his lips. "The kitchen is a woman's hunting ground, dear," he said, his voice laced with amusement. "Your mother needs help with her famous apple pie." I stood frozen, the words hitting me like a physical blow. A moment later, my father placed the heirloom family rifle, a beautiful antique Winchester, into the hands of my brother, Liam. Liam, who flinched at loud noises and couldn't even load a magazine properly. He looked at the weapon with a mixture of fear and entitlement, the perfect embodiment of his character. I was banished to the kitchen. The warm, cloying scent of cinnamon, nutmeg, and stewing apples filled my lungs, feeling thick and suffocating. All morning, as I peeled apples and rolled out dough under my mother's sad, watchful eyes, I could hear the distant, exciting crack of rifle fire echoing from the woods. The sound of a world I was qualified for, but barred from entering. That evening, the great dining hall was filled with celebratory noise. Liam's first kill, a small buck my father had practically herded into his path, was the centerpiece of conversation. He was toasted, praised, his story embellished with each telling, until he sounded like a seasoned hunter. I sat at the far end of the table, silent, pushing the food around on my plate. When dessert was served, a slice of the pie I had helped make was placed in front of me. The filling had congealed and the crust was cold. It tasted like disappointment. That wasn't the only exhibit in the museum. The most prominent one was in the main drawing room, the Maddox Wall of Honor. It was a vast expanse of dark, polished oak, dedicated to the uniformed portraits of the men of the Maddox line, stretching all the way back to the Civil War. It was a silent, imposing testament to our family's patriarchal legacy. When I graduated from the Naval Academy at Annapolis, not just graduated, but did so with honors, my mother had been bursting with pride. She'd had my official portrait in my crisp dress whites, professionally framed. In a quiet act of rebellion, she had hung it in a small, empty space at the very end of the wall. It was her small way of saying, "She belongs here, too." The next time I came home on leave, the picture was gone. A cold dread coiled in my gut. I didn't ask, I just searched. I found it in the storage shed out back, tucked behind a stack of old gardening supplies. It was face down on a pile of yellowing newspapers, as if its very image was an offense. Later, I overheard my grandfather speaking to my mother in the hallway, his voice low but unyielding. "Eleanor, I told you, this wall is for warriors who forge a legacy, not for cogs in a machine." A cog in a machine. That's all my service meant to him. He didn't see a naval officer. He saw a statistical error, a flaw in the system created by gender equality policies he so openly despised. My achievements weren't a source of pride. They were an inconvenience to his perfectly curated narrative. The nights after that were long and silent. I felt a loneliness so profound, it was like a physical ache. Then, one evening, there was a soft creak of my bedroom door. My mother slipped into the room, a shadow in the moonlight. She didn't say much. She knew words were useless against the fortress of my grandfather's will. Instead, she pressed a worn, paperback book into my hand. I looked at the cover. It was a biography of Amelia Earhart. "She flew alone too, Quinn," my mother whispered, her voice barely audible. The world told her she couldn't, but the sky was still hers. She squeezed my hand and was gone as quietly as she came. That night, under the small beam of my reading light, I didn't just read a book. I found a kindred spirit. I read about a woman who refused to be defined by the low expectations of men, who charted her own maps and flew into storms everyone else ran from. She was a sister across time, her story a testament to the fact that you didn't need permission to chase your own horizon. In a small locked box where I kept my most important possessions, I had two secret treasures. The first was the brass compass my maternal grandfather had given me, its needle always pointing true north. The second was now this book. My grandfather's words had built walls around me my entire life, but the story of Amelia Earhart and the compass from a man who believed in me, they gave me a map to get over them. They wanted me in the kitchen. I decided I would own the ocean. My grandfather had sneered at the idea of me getting my hands dirty, of being caked in mud. He had no idea that mud, cold sand, and the biting salt of the ocean were the very elements of the forge I was running toward. They were the things that would burn away the last of the girl who hoped for his approval and temper the woman who no longer needed it. For me, the beaches of Coronado, California were no sunny paradise. They were a battlefield, and the enemy was the voice in my head that whispered I wasn't strong enough. The voice that sounded suspiciously like my grandfather. I learned to fight it at 4 a.m, submerged to my neck in the bone-deep chill of the Pacific. We called it surf torture, and the name was an understatement. The water was a living, breathing entity of cold that seeped into your marrow. The constant motion of the waves ground a slurry of abrasive sand and salt water into every chafe and cut on your skin until your body was a single, unified scream of pain. Badass, basic underwater. Demolition SEAL training was designed to break you. I watched bigger, stronger men who could lift twice their body weight, quit. They had relied on brute muscle, and when that failed, they had nothing left. I didn't have their raw power. I had to be smarter. I learned to use technique to find the perfect point of leverage. I mastered my breathing, turning the icy agony into a low, consistent hum in the background of my mind. I found a point of stillness in the center of the physical hurricane. One of our instructors, a man whose face was a roadmap of hard-won battles, used to bark at us. Your body can handle 10 times what your mind thinks it can. Stop listening to that weak voice in your head. I clung to that sentence like a life raft. My grandfather wanted me in a warm kitchen. It was this freezing, relentless misery that finally made me feel alive. The ultimate test came during Hell Week, 5.5 days of non-stop, punishing evolution, all on less than 4 hours of sleep. Your body is a wreck, your mind a hallucinatory fog. It's here that the real you is exposed. My boat crew was carrying a telephone pole, what we called a log, a massive water-soaked timber that felt like it weighed a ton. We were stumbling through the deep, soft sand, each step an act of pure will. One of my teammates, his face pale with exhaustion, stumbled and fell to his knee. The log dipped dangerously. "I told you," he gasped, spitting out sand and bitterness. "This is no place for a doll." A white-hot flash of anger cut through my exhaustion, but I didn't waste my breath on an argument. I dug my boots into the sand, locked my knees, and tightened my grip on the rough, splintered wood. I took the extra weight onto my own shoulders, my muscles screaming in protest. Then I used the last of my voice. "Get up," I roared, my throat raw from salt and shouting. "We don't leave anyone behind." It wasn't a plea, it was a command. The sheer raw authority in my voice cut through his self-pity. He stared at me for a second, his eyes wide with shock. Then he gritted his teeth, scrambled back to his feet, and put his shoulder back under the log. From then on, no one called me doll. They called me Maddox. The day I graduated Bud-S, standing on that grinder with the few men who had made it through, was the proudest day of my life. The California sun was warm on my face. Families were cheering, crying, rushing forward to pin the coveted trident, the symbol of a Navy SEAL, onto the chests of their sons, their husbands, their brothers. But there was no one there for me. Liam was busy with a law school party. My grandfather, I was told, simply refused to come. In the middle of the celebration, my phone buzzed with a single, short text from my mother. "I'm proud of you." I stood among my brothers in arms, the men I had bled with, and I had never felt so profoundly alone. I had done it. I had proven my worth to the most elite fighting force in the world. But to the family whose name I carried, I was still a ghost, a rounding error in their grand equation. That night, I walked down to the beach alone. I sat in the cool sand and pulled the small, heavy trident from my pocket. It gleamed in the moonlight, its eagle, anchor, and pistol a symbol of everything I had endured and overcome. This small piece of metal was my legacy. It wasn't a Maddox heirloom passed down through a line of entitled men. It was mine, forged in my own sweat, my own blood, and my own steel. I had proven them wrong, but as I sat there, the weight of the trident in my palm felt heavier than any log. It's heavy when you're the only one lifting it. And in that moment, facing a new war fought not with bullets but with lies, I confronted a bitter truth. This battle I couldn't win alone. I sat in my small apartment in Coronado, the late afternoon sun warming the floor. Through the sliding glass door, I could see the collection of rugged cacti on my balcony, standing silent and resilient against the salty air. They were survivors, thriving on neglect. For the first time, I didn't feel a kinship with them. I felt the crushing weight of my own solitude. The trident on my dresser was a testament to what I could endure alone. But this new war was different. This wasn't a battle of physical endurance. It was a battle of truth against a lifetime of lies. And I couldn't fight it alone. My fingers hovered over my phone. There were so few people I could call. Who could possibly understand the suffocating power of a man like my grandfather? With a deep breath that did little to calm the tremor in my hand, I dialed the one number that was both the source of my comfort and my pain, my mother. The phone rang 3 times, each one stretching into an eternity. Finally, her voice came on the line, soft and laced with its usual gentle anxiety. "Quinn, is everything all right, dear?" There was no easy way to say it. I didn't circle the issue. I just laid it out, my voice flat and clinical as I detailed the events at the officers' club, the public humiliation, and the cold, hard fact of the forged signature on the SF-86. The other end of the line went silent. I could hear her take a long, shaky breath. When she finally spoke, her voice was different. The frailty was gone, replaced by something cracked but solid, like earth after a long drought finally receives rain. "I am so sorry, Quinn," she said, and her voice broke on my name. "I have been so weak. For so long I've watched them chip away at you, and I did nothing but offer useless comfort. I let them trample you." She took another breath, this one firm. "But not this time. This stops now. Whatever you need to do, I will do it with you. I have some of his old things in storage. Papers, letters. I don't know if they're useful, but they're yours." For the first time in my 29 years, I didn't feel like my mother was trying to soothe me. I felt like she was standing beside me, ready to hand me a weapon. A friend from the academy had given me a name, a JAG lawyer with a reputation for being brilliant and utterly fearless. The next day, I drove up the coast to a small, quiet coffee shop, tucked away in a La Jolla cove, a place where the gentle sound of the waves seemed to promise discretion. Major Anya Sharma was already there, sitting at a small table in the corner. She stood as I approached, in her uniform with intelligent, perceptive eyes and a handshake that was firm and decisive. She radiated competence. I didn't waste her time. I laid out the facts, just as I had for my mother, and slid a copy of the fraudulent SF-86 across the table. She listened. She didn't interrupt, didn't offer platitudes. Her dark eyes were fixed on mine, and in them I saw no pity, no disbelief, only sharp, focused analysis. She was a fellow warrior, and this was her battlefield. When I finished, she was silent for a moment, her gaze dropping to the forged signature on the paper. Then she looked up, pushed her untouched cup of black coffee to the side, and leaned forward slightly. "Lieutenant," she said, her voice calm but carrying the weight of law. "This isn't a family drama. This is felony fraud against the federal government and a clear violation of Article 134 of the UCMJ. Your security clearance is a national asset, not the Maddox family trust fund." A wave of validation washed over me, so powerful it almost buckled my knees. She got it. "They made a critical mistake," Anya continued, a glint of steel in her eyes. "They assumed you would be silent. They assumed you would protect the family name over your own honor. We are going to prove them wrong." That evening, my small Spartan apartment transformed. Anya arrived with a laptop full of legal databases and stacks of books on military law. My living room became an impromptu war room. On her advice, I made one more call. 20 minutes later, there was a quiet knock on the door. It was Noah Vance, my teammate. A Master Chief, a man of few words and unshakable loyalty. He walked in, gave Anya a short, respectful nod, and took in the scene without a single question. He just found an empty space on the floor, opened his own ruggedized laptop, and got to work. "Anything you need scanned, encrypted, or backtraced, you tell me," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was the most I'd heard him say all week. I looked at the three of us, Anya sharp and fierce, her mind a weapon, Noah silent and steadfast, his loyalty an unbreakable shield, and my mother, a new and unexpected soldier, gathering intelligence from behind enemy lines. This, I realized, was family. Not the one I was born into, defined by blood and betrayal. This was a family forged in a crisis, bound by loyalty, and united by a single, unwavering mission: justice. Anya looked up from her screen. "All right, we have a foundation, but to bring down a man like the Admiral, we can't just have a case. We need an airtight one." She tapped her pen on the table. "We need undeniable proof, anything related to documents, old computers. Did your grandfather ever ask you to do any work on his papers?" Anya's final question hung in the air of my small apartment. Long after she and Noah had left, "Did your grandfather ever ask you to do any work on his papers?" The question acted like a key, turning a rusted lock deep in my memory. And then it sprang open. The drive. It was a few years ago. My grandfather had handed me a sleek, silver lacy external hard drive. His tone had been dismissive, as if assigning me a trivial secretarial task. "I need you to digitize the Maddox service legacy, Quinn," he'd said. "Scan the old commendations, the letters, and I'll need you to sign a few blanket authorizations for archival access, just a formality." I'd done it without a second thought, eager for any crumb of inclusion, any task that made me feel like part of the legacy. I was so foolish. A cold dread, sharp and acidic, rose in my throat. I knelt and reached under my bed, my fingers finding the familiar cold steel of the small footlocker where I kept my most private possessions. I pulled it out. Inside, resting beside my grandfather's compass and the worn paperback about Amelia Earhart, was the silver lacy drive. The juxtaposition made me sick. My two symbols of rebellion and hope, lying next to what I now suspected was the instrument of my betrayal. I took it back to the living room, where Noah had returned and was working silently on his encrypted laptop. I handed it to him without a word. My hands were shaking. He took it, plugged it in, and a few moments later, a single folder appeared on the screen. The name was a cruel irony: Maddox Legacy. Just as Noah's fingers flew across the keyboard, running decryption software, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. The screen lit up with a name I hadn't seen in months: Admiral Alistair Maddox. My heart hammered against my ribs. I looked at Noah, my eyes wide, and held up a single finger, then pointed to his laptop's microphone. He nodded once, his expression grim, and a tiny red light blinked on in the corner of his screen. I answered the call, my voice deliberately calm. "Grandfather." "Quinn." His voice was not the familiar roar of command, but something far more sinister, a smooth, syrupy tone of feigned concern. "I hear you've been stirring up some unpleasantness." I remained silent, letting the dead air stretch. "You know, family is the most important thing we have," he continued, his voice dripping with false wisdom. "Liam, he made a small youthful mistake. A boy's ambition got the better of him. Surely you wouldn't let a little bit of a woman's pride destroy your brother's future? The honor of this entire family? The audacity of it, the sheer calculated manipulation, took my breath away. He was using the very words, the very tactics he had used to control and diminish me my entire life. "This ends now, Quinn." His voice hardened, the velvet glove slipping to reveal the iron fist beneath. "Drop it. If you don't, I will be forced to take measures you will not like. Do you understand me?" He wasn't asking, he was threatening me. And in doing so, in his supreme arrogance, he had just confessed. "I understand perfectly," I said, my voice as cold and empty as a spent shell casing, and ended the call. I turned back to the screen, my entire being buzzing with an Arctic rage. "Did you get it?" "Every word," Noah confirmed. At that moment, a new window popped open on the screen. Anya's remote decryption had worked. The contents of the Maddox Legacy folder were exposed, and my heart stopped. It wasn't a legacy of service, it was a spider web of greed. It wasn't just Liam's SF-86. There were folders within folders. I clicked open the first one. Inside were documents for at least 5 different defense contracts, all with private military companies I'd vaguely heard of. And attached to each one, like a stamp of approval, was a scanned copy of a document bearing my name, my rank, and my TS-SCI security clearance code. My top-secret sensitive compartmented information clearance, earned through years of rigorous vetting and proven trustworthiness, was being used as a golden ticket, allowing these companies to bypass the most stringent background checks for lucrative government contracts. My blood ran cold. This was bigger than Liam. This was bigger than anything I could have imagined. Then my eyes fell on one name in particular. A company called Aegis Dynamic Solutions. I recognized it. My finger, trembling now, clicked open the file. It was a multi-million-dollar contract to supply next-generation surveillance drones to SOCOM, Special Operations Command, to my command. The air left my lungs. They were making millions of dollars off the back of my honor, my service. The drones my brothers in arms were relying on in the field, the technology they trusted with their lives, was being supplied by a company that had secured its contract using my stolen identity. Every single sacrifice I had ever made, every freezing night, every grueling mission, the friends I'd lost, the blood I'd shed, had been monetized. They hadn't just stolen my name. They had taken the most sacred part of me, my oath to my country and my brothers, and sold it to the highest bidder. A rage so pure and so profound filled me that there was no room for anything else. There were no tears. There was no shouting. There was only a cold, silent, and absolute certainty. I turned to my own laptop, my movements precise and deliberate. I opened a secure email client, addressed it to Anya, and typed 2 words into the subject line. We got them. I hit send. War had been declared. The discovery of the hard drive left a layer of ice in my veins. I spent the night in a state of controlled, simmering rage. the facts of their betrayal replaying in my mind like a mission briefing. But the full, unrestrained fury didn't hit me until the next morning. It didn't come from a memory or a document. It came from a simple text message. It was from an old teammate, a screenshot with no comment. I didn't need one. The image filled my phone's screen. It was my brother, Liam, on Instagram. He was standing on a pristine white sand beach in Maui, the turquoise water impossibly blue behind him. He was grinning, tanned, holding up a fancy cocktail with a pineapple wedge on the rim. He was surrounded by a laughing group of his equally smug-looking friends. And below the picture, the caption, written for the whole world to see, "Hard work pays off. Grateful for my family's support." My blood didn't just run cold, it stopped. It froze solid in my veins. My gaze drifted to the date stamp on the post. June 14th, today. Today was the anniversary of the day Sergeant Tom Axe Jensen died in my arms in the Somali dust, a piece of shrapnel in his chest. Today was the day I sat alone in my quiet apartment, remembering the sound of his last breath, honoring his sacrifice, and my brother, the man whose future was being funded by the perversion of that very sacrifice, was working hard by sipping a Mai Tai in paradise. The insult was so profound, so utterly desecrating, that it broke through the discipline and control I had spent a lifetime building. This wasn't just a betrayal anymore. This was a desecration. The cold rage melted into a white-hot inferno. My hands moved on their own, my thumb finding Liam's contact information. I didn't hesitate. I pressed the call button. He answered on the third ring, his voice thick with sleep and irritation. "What is it, Quinn?" I didn't waste time on greetings. "You're in Hawaii?" My voice was a blade of ice. "Yeah, so?" he mumbled, a note of annoyance in his voice. I needed a break. A break. The word came out as a low growl, a sound I didn't recognize as my own. "Is that what you call it? Today is the anniversary of Axe's death. Do you have any idea how he died, Liam? He died so that entitled cowards like you could sit safely in your law offices and take breaks in Hawaii. Do you have any idea where the family support you're so grateful for comes from?" I was practically yelling into the phone now. "It comes from our blood, from the blood of men like Axe." The other end was silent for a beat, then a confused, stuttering voice. What are you talking about?" "You'll find out soon enough," I said, and I disconnected the call, the finality of the click echoing in the silent room. I couldn't breathe. I bolted from my apartment, driven by a primal need to move, to run. I hit the pavement and ran toward the ocean, the hard rhythm of my feet on the concrete, the only thing keeping me grounded. The wind coming off the Pacific whipped at my face, but it did nothing to cool the fire raging inside me. My run ended at the foot of the Navy SEAL Memorial on the Coronado shore. I stood there, panting, my hands on my knees, staring at the wall of bronze plaques bearing the names of the fallen. My eyes found his, Thomas R. Jensen. They had died for something, for honor, for their country, for the man next to them, and my family, my own blood, had turned that sacred sacrifice into a business transaction, a punchline. How much can one person take before they break? How many times can you let them trample on everything you hold sacred before you decide that silence is no longer an option, but a betrayal in itself? I closed my eyes, and a memory of my grandmother surfaced, her voice reading from her worn King James Bible on a Sunday afternoon, a verse she had made me memorize, Isaiah 41:10. "So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you." In that moment, Standing before the names of the dead, a profound clarity washed over me. The decision was made. The debate was over. I would not just expose them. I would tear down the entire rotten empire they had built on a foundation of lies and dishonor. I pulled out my phone, my hand now perfectly steady. I scrolled to Anya's number. "Major," I said when she answered, my voice terrifyingly calm. "It's time to attack." My call with Anya acted as a starting pistol. The raw, explosive anger of the previous hours began to cool and solidify, transforming into the cold, sharp focus of a mission. The grief was still there, the rage was still there, but now they were fuel. And I was about to channel that fuel into a very precise engine of destruction. One of my BUDS instructors used to scream at us, "Plan your mission, execute your mission." That's exactly what I intended to do. My apartment became a command center. The cheap whiteboard I normally used for grocery lists was now covered in flowcharts, names, and arrows drawn in black and red marker. It looked like the planning board for a raid. Anya, Noah, and I were its command staff. "Our primary target is not Liam," Anya said, her voice sharp as she circled my grandfather's name with a red marker. The color seemed to bleed on the white surface. "He's just a pawn, a useful idiot. The king is Admiral Alistair Maddox, and the network of defense contractors he's been cultivating. We have to hit him where it hurts the most, his reputation and his finances." The strategy felt strangely familiar. It was mission planning, pure and simple. We broke it down into 3 phases. Phase 1, consolidate evidence and secure a corroborating witness. Phase 2, direct confrontation and record a confession. Phase 3, simultaneous submission of the entire case file to the Naval Inspector General and the Department of Justice. It was intelligence gathering, direct action, and exfiltration. I knew this playbook by heart. Our intelligence gathering began with the hard drive. As Anya and Noah dug through encrypted folders, one name kept appearing in the metadata of the most sensitive documents. Corporal Kenji Tanaka. According to his file, he'd been my grandfather's personal clerk, his paper pusher. The records also showed he'd taken an abrupt and unexpected early discharge from the Navy, just weeks after the largest of the Aegis contracts were signed. It was too much of a coincidence. "He's the weak link," Anya stated, her eyes narrowed in concentration. "And that makes him the most important one. If he talks, if he agrees to testify about what he saw, this case goes from strong to hermetically sealed." Noah, working his quiet magic, found him in under an hour. Tanaka was living off the grid in a small rural town in Oregon, working as a carpenter. He had tried to become a ghost. I knew instantly that I had to be the one to go. Anya could send a subpoena, but a man hiding in fear wouldn't respond to a legal threat. He would just run deeper. Only a soldier could talk to another soldier. We spoke a different language, one built on shared hardship and unspoken codes of honor. I had to remind him of that. The flight to Oregon was long. I spent the time going over what I would say, but I knew it was useless. This wasn't about a script. It was about connection. I found Tanaka in a large, dusty workshop that smelled beautifully of pine and sawdust. He was thinner than in his service photo, and his eyes, the eyes of a man who lives in constant, low-grade fear, darted around nervously. He looked older than his years. When I introduced myself as Lieutenant Quinn Maddox, the chisel in his hand clattered to the floor. "I don't know anything," he stammered, his hands immediately raising in a gesture of surrender. He wouldn't even look me in the eye. I didn't press. I didn't raise my voice. I simply found an old wooden stool and sat down, letting the silence of the workshop settle around us. Then I told him about Axe. I told him about the men I served with, about the risks they were taking every single day. I told him about the Aegis drones, the ones whose procurement contracts he had personally notarized, and how those drones were now flying over the heads of my teammates in hostile territory. "I'm not asking you to go up against an admiral, Corporal," I said, my voice soft but firm. "I'm asking you to stand with the soldiers on the ground, your brothers, my brothers. Your silence right now, it's helping them turn our sacrifices into their profit margin. It's making them rich off the blood of men like Axe." He still wouldn't look at me, but I saw his knuckles turn white, and as he gripped the edge of his workbench. I had said what I needed to say. I placed a small card with Anya's number on it next to him. "If you decide you want to do the right thing, call this number. She'll protect you." I turned and walked away, the scent of sawdust following me out the door. I didn't know if I had succeeded. I spent the flight back to San Diego in a state of suspended animation, the entire operation hanging on the decision of one scared man in Oregon. As my plane was descending through the coastal fog, my phone vibrated. It was a text from Anya. "Tanaka called. He's in. He'll sign a sworn affidavit." A wave of relief so intense it felt like a physical impact washed over me. I leaned my head back against the seat and closed my eyes. Phase 1 complete. I pulled up my contact list, my thumb hovering over my grandfather's name. It was time for Phase 2. It was time to walk into the lion's den. Phase 2 required a very specific battlefield, one of his choosing, not mine. I selected the Army and Navy Club in Washington, D.C., a place so steeped in tradition that the very air felt heavy with the ghosts of past power. I chose it because it was his sanctuary, a fortress of mahogany and brass, where generations of stern-faced generals and admirals stared down from their gilded oil portraits. It was the last place on earth he would ever expect to be vulnerable. In his throne room, a king never fears a coup. I prepared for the role meticulously. I left my uniform in the garment bag. Instead, I wore a civilian suit, a simple but impeccably tailored charcoal gray ensemble that spoke of quiet, professional competence. It was a deliberate choice, a visual counter-narrative to the mud-caked grunt he had so publicly dismissed. Tucked into the inner pocket of my blazer, resting coolly against my heart, was my primary weapon, a sleek black fountain pen. To any observer, it was an elegant writing instrument. In reality, it was a high-fidelity micro-recorder, patiently waiting to do its work. This was my direct action, and the pen was my blade. He was waiting for me in a private study they had reserved, a room that smelled of old leather, expensive cigar smoke, and centuries of unquestioned authority. He was sunk deep into an oxblood leather armchair, a heavy crystal tumbler of dark cognac swirling in his hand. The low light from a single green-shaded desk lamp cast long, imposing shadows, making the room feel like a cave and him, the creature at its center. He watched me as I crossed the thick Persian rug, his eyes glinting with a predatory amusement, the look of a cat watching a mouse wander into a trap. "Well, well," he began, his voice a low, condescending rumble that vibrated through the quiet room. "The puppy has grown some teeth, has she?" This was the opening salvo. I had anticipated it, drilled for it. My training taught me to never meet an opponent's strength head-on. His strength was aggression. His weakness, the fatal flaw in his armor, was his monumental arrogance. That was my target. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't square my shoulders. Instead, I let them slump, just slightly. I allowed a carefully crafted flicker of fear and confusion to cross my face. I became, for one last time, the granddaughter he always believed me to be. Weak, uncertain, and desperately in need of his patriarchal guidance. "Grandfather, I don't understand," I began, my voice pitched to sound shaky, fragile. "Everything is getting so complicated. Liam said I just needed to sign some papers, something about the family archives. Now there are lawyers calling me. I'm scared, Grandfather. I'm scared I'm going to get in trouble." It worked perfectly. I watched his entire posture change. The hard, suspicious lines of his face softened, replaced by a mask of profound, patronizing self-satisfaction. He had been expecting a fight, a foolish, emotional outburst. My apparent submission was a balm to his ego, a confirmation of his own superiority. He was in control. There, he said, his voice taking on that same syrupy, manipulative tone he'd used on the phone. He gestured with his glass toward the chair opposite him. "Don't you worry your pretty little head about it. I have taken care of everything. All you need to do is be quiet." He leaned back, the leather groaning under his weight. "It's about strategy, Quinn, a concept that is perhaps beyond your pay grade. This world doesn't run on fairness. It runs on power and influence. It always has." He paused, taking a slow sip of his cognac, savoring the moment, savoring his own lecture. "Your name, your clearance, they have value. They are assets, and I have leveraged those assets to strengthen this family's position for generations to come. Frankly, you should be proud to have played your part." This was it. The moment of truth. The final approach to the target. I summoned a tear to the corner of my eye, a masterful touch of stagecraft I didn't know I possessed. I let my lip tremble. "But it was fraud, wasn't it, Grandfather?" I asked, my voice a broken whisper, laced with the tremor of a terrified child who has just realized the world is a dark and dangerous place. He threw his head back and laughed. It was not a warm, familial sound. It was the cold, sharp bark of a predator that knows it has cornered its prey. It was a sound of absolute victory. "Fraud," he scoffed, dabbing at the corner of his eye with a silk pocket square. "That's a word for the weak, Quinn. For victims, I call it leveraging assets. Your security clearance, my dear, is an asset of the Maddox family. It belongs to this family, just as the farm in Virginia or the house here in D.C. belongs to us. I built this name, this legacy, with my own two hands, and I have every right to use every tool at my disposal to maintain it." He leaned forward then, his eyes boring into me, the mask of the benevolent patriarch now completely gone, revealing the unvarnished tyrant beneath. His voice dropped to a conspiratorial, chilling growl. "You, Liam, all of you are instruments for the preservation of that legacy. You are tools in my toolbox. A grunt soldier like you, a simple tool, could never possibly understand the burdens of a man in my position." He had said it all. He hadn't just admitted to it. He was boasting. He believed it was his divine right. He saw me as nothing more than an object, a piece of property. The final piece of evidence was secure. I let the silence hang in the air for a 3 count, letting his words fully saturate the recording, letting them etch themselves into digital permanence. Then I slowly rose to my feet. I straightened my jacket, and as I did, the frightened lost girl I was playing evaporated. The slump in my shoulders vanished, replaced by the ramrod-straight posture of a naval officer. The fear in my eyes was replaced by a cold, calm emptiness. I reached into my blazer, and he watched, a flicker of confusion clouding his features. I pulled out the fountain pen. I didn't point it at him. I simply capped it, the click of the lid snapping shut, echoing in the silent, tomb-like room. Then I placed it back in my inner pocket. "Thank you, Admiral," I said. My voice was perfectly level, devoid of all emotion, as clear and cold as a winter morning. "You just signed your own conviction." The self-satisfied, arrogant smirk on his face froze, then collapsed. His eyes widened, the pupils contracting, as the meaning of my words, the click of the pen, the sudden, terrifying transformation in my demeanor, all slammed into him at once. The king, in his own throne room, had just been checkmated, and he finally realized he had been playing against a grandmaster all along. I walked out of the Army and Navy Club and into the cool Washington, D.C. night, feeling strangely hollow. The adrenaline from the confrontation drained away, leaving behind a profound exhaustion. The victory didn't feel triumphant. It felt heavy, like the silence after an explosion. The Admiral, however, was not a man to accept defeat quietly. His retaliation was swift and vicious. By midnight, his Plan B was in full effect. The attack came not from a direct confrontation, but from the insidious world of anonymous sources and digital whispers. An article appeared on a prominent military affairs blog, a respected outlet many of my peers read daily. The headline was subtle but damning. "Concerns mount over decorated SEAL officers' stability." The article quoted unnamed sources close to the Maddox family, who expressed deep concern for my well-being. It insinuated that I was suffering from a complex and severe case of PTSD following my recent deployment. It painted my quest for justice as erratic behavior, a symptom of my instability, a potential threat to national security. They had taken the sacred wounds of my service, the invisible scars of war, and twisted them into weapons to use against me, to discredit me, to silence me. It was the most cowardly, despicable thing he had ever done. My phone rang. It was Anya. "I see it," she said, her voice a tight coil of controlled anger. "I knew he'd pull something like this. The last resort of a guilty man is to paint his accuser as insane." "What do we do?" I asked, my own voice sounding tired, distant. "Nothing," she replied firmly. "We let them scream into the void. This is a temper tantrum. They're showing their desperation. We won't respond with a press release. We'll respond with a federal indictment. Let them have the blogs. We're taking the courthouse." Her confidence was an anchor in the storm. But the real turning point came the next morning. My mother called. Her voice wasn't the familiar, fearful whisper I had known my whole life. It was clear and strong, humming with a righteous fury I had never heard before. "I saw the article, Quinn," she said, no preamble. "Your grandfather, he's gone too far. This is not about honor anymore. This is just cruelty." I heard the rustle of papers on her end of the line. "I'm not going to be silent anymore. I'm writing a sworn statement for Anya. I'm going to tell them everything, about the hunting trip, about the wall of honor, about every time he belittled you and every time your father stood by and let it happen. I will let the whole world know who is truly unstable in this family." A lump formed in my throat. It was in that moment that I knew, with absolute certainty, that we had won. The fire my grandfather had tried so desperately to extinguish in me hadn't died. It had spread, and it was about to burn his entire rotten empire to the ground. That night, back in my apartment, I sat alone in the quiet darkness, the city lights of San Diego glittering below. The adrenaline was gone. The anger had cooled. All that was left was a vast, quiet space of grief and resolution. I picked up my phone and opened my contact list. My thumb scrolled down to 2 names, grandfather, Liam. They had been in my phone for years, remnants of a foolish, persistent hope that one day a call from them would be different. That one day I'd get the apology, the acknowledgement, the love I had once craved. But I knew now that call would never come. They were who they were. The poison was in the roots of the tree. I took a deep, steadying breath, and I pressed delete. A strange feeling washed over me, a bizarre cocktail of profound relief and a deep, aching sadness. It wasn't just deleting a phone number. It was the final act of severing a toxic limb to save the whole. It was the acceptance of an ending. It was me finally closing the door on the past so I could build a future where I, and I alone, decided who was allowed to walk through my door. A moment later, my screen still glowing in the dark, I tapped Add New Contact. I typed in a new name, a new ally, a new beginning, Anya Sharma. The case file we submitted, fortified by my recording, Tanaka's sworn affidavit, and my mother's powerfully damning testimony, wasn't a spark. It was an earthquake. The Department of Justice launched a full-scale investigation that rocked the foundations of the military-industrial complex. The fall of the House of Maddox wasn't a loud, dramatic explosion. It was the quiet, final click of federal prison doors shutting. Admiral Alistair Maddox was indicted for conspiracy, fraud, and abuse of power. Liam was charged with complicity and perjury. The news sent shockwaves through the military community. As expected, some called me a traitor to my own blood, a disgrace to the family name. But for every one of those voices, there were dozens of others. Quiet emails and messages flooded my inbox, mostly from other women in the service, pilots, intelligence officers, Marines. They didn't offer pity, they offered solidarity. One simply said, "Thank you for giving us a voice." It turned out my actions had an unforeseen consequence. The Navy launched an internal review of its security clearance sponsorship protocols, a reform that became unofficially known in the Pentagon hallways as the Maddox Amendment. I had set out to reclaim my name and ended up changing the system. A few months later, after the media frenzy had died down and the dust had begun to settle, a letter arrived at my apartment. The return address was a federal penitentiary. It was from Liam. I opened it to find a single, hastily scrawled line on a piece of cheap paper. "I'm sorry." I read the words over and over, trying to find some weight in them, some flicker of genuine remorse. But there was none. They were just words, empty and offered far too late. They were the apology of a man who was sorry he got caught, not sorry for what he had done. That evening, I took the letter to the beach. Noah and Anya were there with me, and we had a small bonfire crackling in a fire pit near the dunes. The salt air was cool, the sound of the waves, a steady, peaceful rhythm. I looked at my chosen family, the steadfast soldier and the brilliant lawyer who had stood by me when the world turned upside down. I took Liam's letter, looked at it one last time in the flickering firelight, and then I dropped it into the flames. We watched as the paper curled, blackened, and dissolved into a wisp of gray ash that drifted up into the night sky. "Some things can't be fixed," I said quietly, more to myself than to them. Anya, sitting beside me, looked from the fire to me, her expression soft. "And that's okay," she said. Her words were a gift, a form of permission I didn't know I needed. Permission to let go without guilt. Permission to accept that some wounds don't heal, they just become a part of you. Months later, I was sitting in my own office at the Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado. It was early morning, and through my window I could see the teams on the grinder going through their morning PT, their determined shouts cutting through the cool air. On my desk lay a file. It wasn't a forged document. It wasn't evidence. It was an application for the position of SEAL Team Commander, a role no woman had ever held. I picked up my pen, the same pen I had used to record my grandfather's confession. I uncapped it and looked down at the empty signature line. Quinn Maddox, a name they had tried to bury in mud and shame. But it had survived. Now it stood for something else. It was an imprint of truth, of honor, and of a future I would command myself. I signed my name. The ink flowed, dark and decisive. The stroke was strong. Outside, the Pacific Ocean whispered against the shore. The storm had passed, the sun was rising, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt at peace. I was still standing. That was my storm, and I know many of you are facing your own. It may not be against an admiral in a boardroom, but that feeling of being silenced, of being told you're not enough, that's a battle we all understand. What I learned in the forge of it all is this: your name, your honor, and your future belong to you alone. The pen you use to write your own story is already in your hand. If stories like this give you strength, if they are a reminder of the power of your own voice, then follow our channel. There are more battles to witness and more voices waiting to be heard. Your support helps us bring them to light.